It began with silence, then disbelief. On a bright August morning in 1966, Israeli radar stations near the Negev desert picked up an unidentified aircraft entering from the east. Controllers scrambled 2 Mirage jets to intercept, expecting another hostile incursion from Syria or Iraq. But what they saw defied logic. The aircraft was a MiG-21, the most advanced Soviet fighter in existence, the nightmare of every Western Air Force, and instead of attacking, it was descending with landing gear down. The Mirages held formation, guns armed but frozen. One Israeli pilot muttered, "Don't shoot! He's coming to us!" Minutes later, the MiG touched down on Israeli soil, perfectly intact. The most closely guarded weapon of the Soviet bloc was now in Mossad's hands. That landing was the final move in a plan that had taken more than a year to design, a web of deception and psychology so intricate, it became one of the boldest intelligence operations of the Cold War. Operation Diamond. To understand why Mossad risked everything for a single jet, you have to remember what the MiG-21 meant in the 1960s. It was the Soviet Union's answer to American air superiority, a supersonic interceptor capable of climbing faster than anything in NATO's inventory. It could hit Mach 2, carry heat-seeking missiles, and vanish from radar almost as quickly as it appeared. When U.S. U-2 reconnaissance planes photographed MiG-21 squadrons across the Middle East, the Pentagon called it the most dangerous fighter on Earth. The MiG-21 represented over $2 billion in Soviet R&D investment, the most expensive fighter program in USSR history. Israel's neighbors, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, had begun receiving the MiG from Moscow. Each delivery tilted the balance of power a little further away from Israel. In Washington, generals gathered around grainy U-2 photographs of airfields in Cairo and Damascus. The MiGs appeared as blurred crescents of light, streaking off the runway before radar could even lock on. American analysts called them ghost wings. In Tel Aviv, Israeli commanders marked every new Soviet shipment with red pins on a wall map. The map looked like it was bleeding. Newspapers speculated about the day an Arab pilot might reach Haifa in 2 minutes flat. The MiG-21 wasn't just a machine, it was the sound of inevitability. And inevitability had to be stolen. Every MiG that roared over Cairo or Damascus meant one more coffin waiting in Israel. For the pilots watching from below, the MiG wasn't just metal, it was mortality. To fight what you don't understand is suicide. And so the Israeli intelligence community came to one conclusion. If they couldn't outbuild the MiG-21, they would steal it. The mission fell to Mossad's most secretive division, Tevel, the Foreign Operations Branch. Their target wasn't a military base or an airfield, it was a single man. If they could persuade one pilot to defect with his jet, they'd gain not just a weapon, but the entire blueprint of Soviet aviation. It sounded impossible, until Mossad analysts started looking at Iraq. The Iraqi Air Force had just received a batch of brand new MiG-21s, but its officers were divided along religious and ethnic lines. Among them was a 32-year-old flight instructor named Munir Redfa. He was an Assyrian Christian in a service dominated by Sunni Muslims, often sidelined and humiliated by superiors who questioned his loyalty. He flew well, taught others even better, but was never promoted. For Mossad, that resentment was oxygen. The approach had to be indirect. Sending an Israeli spy into Iraq would have been suicide. Instead, Mossad used European intermediaries, Lebanese businessmen, art dealers, and social connectors with dual loyalties. In the summer of 1965, one of them met Redfa during a supposed aviation technology conference in Europe. They discussed engines, travel, the tension in Baghdad, casual conversations designed to build trust. Months later, a woman entered the story. Her name was kept secret even in Mossad files. She was codenamed Yasmin. Beautiful, fluent in Arabic and French, she worked for Israeli intelligence under diplomatic cover. Her task was simple and lethal. Identify Redfa's frustrations, amplify them, and make him dream of a different life. Yasmin was unlike anyone in Mossad's roster. Recruited from the French diplomatic corps, she'd grown up in Beirut, half Lebanese, half French, comfortable in salons and back alleys alike. She wasn't a honey trap, she was a mirror. Over months of meetings, in Vienna cafes, Amsterdam hotels, airport lounges. She studied Redfa with the precision of a surgeon. She learned the rhythm of his speech, the way he softened when he spoke about his son, the bitterness that surfaced when he mentioned his superiors. Each detail became a thread in a tapestry of trust. She never once mentioned politics. Instead, she spoke of flying, the silence above clouds, the loneliness of pilots who serve men they don't respect. Redfa called her the only person who actually listens. When he joked that he'd fly anywhere for peace, she smiled and said, "Then maybe one day, you should." Back in Tel Aviv, her handlers debated whether she'd gone too far. One report described her emotional entanglement, a diplomatic term for empathy. But Yasmin understood the mission better than anyone. Redfa didn't need seduction. He needed belief. So she gave him that, piece by piece, until the impossible no longer felt impossible. What Yasmin never told her handlers was how much she feared the quiet between their meetings. She'd sit in her hotel room, listening to the hum of the minibar, wondering whether Redfa's voice would come through the phone again. For Mossad, she was an operative. For him, she became an idea, the first person who treated him as something more than a tool. Her reports to Tel Aviv began to read like diary entries. "He believes I understand him." Her chief crossed out the line and wrote in red ink, "Good. Keep it that way." On their final meeting, in a cafe near Brussels, she slid him an envelope with flight maps and a new passport photo. He looked at her for a long time and said, "You'll never see me again, will you?" She smiled and lied, "Of course I will." The offer was extraordinary. Mossad would pay Redfa an estimated $1 million in 1966, equivalent to $9.5 million today, plus lifetime relocation support for his family. Through Yasmin, Mossad learned what Redfa valued most, his family. He kept a small photograph of his children folded inside his flight logbook, creases worn white where he touched their faces before every sortie. He loved flying, but he feared for his wife and children, who were often harassed by Iraqi security for being Christian. He'd confided to her that he wished he could fly somewhere they can never reach me. That line became the cornerstone of Operation Diamond. Over the next 6 months, the team crafted an escape plan that offered exactly that: a new identity, financial stability, and complete safety for his family, if he delivered the MiG-21. Before any promises were made, Mossad needed absolute confirmation that he could do it. Could he take off armed, fly west, cross Jordanian and Syrian airspace, and reach Israel before running out of fuel? Every kilometer of the route was mapped in advance. Israeli pilots simulated the flight repeatedly, calculating where radar would pick him up and when enemy controllers might realize he'd vanished. The plan was ruthless in its precision. Redfa would depart from an Iraqi base under the pretext of a training sortie, stay low to avoid radar, skim the desert floor at 500 knots, and then climb sharply only once he neared the Israeli border. Meanwhile, Mossad's logistics unit began the harder task, extracting his family. One by one, under false identities, they were flown to Europe through commercial routes. First the wife under the guise of visiting relatives, then the children with fabricated medical visas. Each relocation was timed to look natural. Any sudden disappearance would have blown the operation. Inside Mossad headquarters, every time a phone rang, someone froze, afraid Baghdad had discovered the plot before the plane ever left the ground. By early August 1966, his entire family was safe in a Mossad-controlled apartment in a European city. Only then did Redfa receive final confirmation. His loved ones were out, and the sky was clear. In the Mossad operations room, the air felt electrified. Radios muted, cigarettes burning down untouched, eyes fixed on a single frequency. Each sweep of radar from the Iraqi border felt like a heartbeat. One officer whispered, "If he's caught, they'll hang his family in public." Another replied, "They can't. His family's already gone." No one looked at the clock. They were listening for the moment history decided which side it preferred. The night before takeoff, the Iraqi airbase crackled with unease. Rumors spread that someone inside the Air Force was planning to flee. Security officers prowled the hangars, flashlights cutting through the dark. One of them stopped beside Redfa's MiG, leafing through his flight log, his cigarette ash falling on the cockpit rim. Redfa stood frozen, heart hammering so loud he thought the guard could hear it. The officer shrugged and walked away. In Tel Aviv, Mossad's operations room sat in total blackout, phones silent, every agent waiting for a single call. Hours later, Yasmin reached Redfa on a secure line routed through Europe. Her voice was steady, rehearsed. "When you start the engine, don't stop for anything. Don't look back." He said only one word. "Understood." Then he hung up and stared at the plane that would either free him or bury him. The operation's name, Diamond, was chosen for its symbolism: small, priceless, and impossible to replace. On August 16th, Redfa climbed into his MiG-21 at an Iraqi base outside Baghdad. He told ground crew he was testing a new fuel configuration and might be gone longer than usual. At 10:30 a.m. local time, he lifted off, climbing steadily before banking west. No one suspected anything, at first. Halfway across the desert, he descended to treetop level, hugging the terrain to hide from radar. His altimeter showed just 80 feet. At that height, even a bird strike could have ended the mission. He flew blind through heat shimmer and dust storms, trusting only the compass fixed in front of him. He switched frequencies, cut radio contact, and followed a preset compass bearing known only to him and Mossad. When Jordanian controllers briefly picked up a radar blip, it disappeared too quickly to identify. Syrian radar caught it next but assumed it was one of their own. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, Redfa was crossing into Israeli airspace. Israeli radar stations lit up instantly. Unknown aircraft, east to west, high speed. But crossing Syria was like flying through a minefield of invisible eyes. At 500 knots, the desert blurred into heat and static. The MiG's radar warning light flickered once, then again. Was it a lock-on or just electrical noise? He dropped altitude, scraping the horizon so low that dust smeared the canopy. For 11 seconds, Syrian radar tracked an unidentified echo, then lost it in ground clutter. Redfa felt the air thin, the fuel gauge dipping fast. If he was caught now, he'd vanish without a trace, his name erased by dawn. He gritted his teeth, climbed sharply, and broke radio silence with a single pulse, the coded ping Mossad had told him to send when he was safe. No answer came back. Just the endless hum of the engine and the sound of his own breath. Standard procedure was to scramble interceptors. 2 Mirage 3s shot into the sky. They closed in and saw the impossible, a MiG-21, fully operational, flying straight toward them without weapons locked. Command ordered them to hold fire and escort. The MiG circled once, dropped landing gear, and touched down on the runway at an airbase in northern Israel. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then ground crews erupted, cameras flashing, soldiers shouting, disbelief mixing with exhilaration. Floodlights snapped on across the tarmac. Technicians in coveralls ran forward like surgeons to a patient still breathing. The MiG's metal skin shimmered under sodium light, heat still rising from its engines. Photographers circled, taking hundreds of frames before the aircraft even cooled. Every bolt, every panel line, every serial number was documented before sunrise. One mechanic whispered, "This is what victory smells like." By dawn, the jet was already under guard inside a hangar sealed by armed soldiers and silence. The Soviet Union's most advanced fighter now belonged to Israel. Mossad immediately whisked Redfa to a secure debriefing site. He was calm, almost detached. He asked one question first, whether his family had arrived safely. When they showed him the photos, his composure cracked for the first time. Relief looked almost like grief. Then he told them everything: flight manuals, radar codes, performance limits, fuel behavior, missile guidance quirks. Within days, Israeli engineers were taking the MiG apart bolt by bolt. The data transformed Israel's entire air combat doctrine. They learned the MiG's turning radius, its radar blind spots, the delay in its missile locking system, and how it lost energy in high-G maneuvers. Pilots trained to exploit those flaws, and within months, Israel's Air Force could consistently defeat MiG-21s in mock combat. When Israel shared the MiG-21 data with the Pentagon, analysts estimated it saved the U.S. $500 million in counter-aircraft development costs. When the Six-Day War erupted the following year, those lessons decided the skies consistently defeat MiG-21s in mock combat. The success of Operation Diamond sent shockwaves across the Middle East. In Baghdad, panic turned to rage. The Iraqi Air Force launched mass interrogations. Dozens of officers were arrested and several executed. The Soviets dispatched emergency advisors to tighten security at all their client bases. They demanded to know how a single pilot could have defected without warning. KGB investigators arrived in Baghdad, reviewing every file, every radio log. But they found nothing. Baghdad turned into a city of ghosts. The morning after the defection, every officer at the airbase was summoned for interrogation. Families were dragged into hallways under floodlights, questioned about phone calls they never made. The base commander ordered all pilots grounded indefinitely. Half the fleet sat rotting on the tarmac. Rumors spread that Redfa had been kidnapped by Zionist commandos. Others swore they'd seen him on television in Tel Aviv. The truth was worse than the rumor. It meant anyone could be next. At Soviet headquarters in Moscow, a telex arrived from Baghdad. Trust compromised. Request purge authority. The reply came instantly. Approved. In Moscow, denial turned to fury. The KGB opened a file codenamed The Thief of Baghdad and dispatched investigators to purge the Iraqi Air Force. Officers were dragged from beds, interrogated until sunrise, accused of treason without evidence. One colonel disappeared. Another was found hanging in his quarters. Soviet advisors demanded that examples be made. Mossad intercepted a telegram from a GRU liaison to Baghdad. It ended with one line: "We will retrieve the diamond." But they never did. The gem was already locked inside Israel's vaults, its secret worth more than any ransom. Redfa had left no trace except an empty hangar and an embarrassed regime. For Moscow, the loss was catastrophic. A single aircraft now exposed the vulnerabilities of the entire MiG-21 fleet exported to Warsaw Pact allies. Design bureaus in the Soviet Union were ordered to modify future models immediately. New radar, new friend or foe coding, new fuel controls. Moscow spent an estimated $150 million retrofitting MiG-21 fleets across 15 countries to prevent future defections. But by then, the damage was irreversible. For Redfa, it wasn't triumph, it was survival. Every report of new executions in Baghdad was a reminder of what his freedom had cost. In Tel Aviv, the mood inside Mossad was both triumphant and cautious. They knew they had achieved the unthinkable, but they also knew they had crossed a line that would never be forgiven. For years afterward, Soviet intelligence quietly targeted Israeli operatives across Europe in retaliation, believing they could outsmart Mossad. But they had no idea what was coming next. The hunt was about to reverse. Watch how Mossad hunted the KGB, the next chapter in this true story of spies and vengeance. Assassination attempts, surveillance, and disinformation campaigns all trace their lineage back to that one morning in 1966 when a MiG landed where it never should have. Still, the results spoke for themselves. Israel now possessed the knowledge to counter every Soviet fighter deployed in the region. Air combat was no longer guesswork. It was science. Redfa and his family were relocated under new identities. For a time, they lived quietly in Europe, under constant protection. But freedom carried its own weight. He struggled with isolation and guilt, knowing that many of his colleagues had been executed because of his defection. Mossad reports later described him as restless, haunted by the very skies that once made him feel invincible. He never flew again. Yasmin was pulled from Europe 6 weeks later. Her mission file was sealed, her codename deleted from Mossad records. She spent her debriefing in silence, chain-smoking through the night. When her supervisor asked whether she felt guilty, she said, "He got what he wanted." Then, after a pause, "But so did we." Years later, An anonymous postcard arrived at an Israeli embassy in Paris. No name, no signature, just a sketch of a MiG soaring west into sunlight. The handwriting matched Yasmin's. It was the last trace of her existence. He died years later, far from home. A man who had changed history but never escaped its cost. The captured MiG-21 was later loaned to allied nations for analysis, but its greatest value remained within Israel. Test pilots flew it against every aircraft in their inventory, perfecting counter-tactics that would define future wars. When Israeli Mirages and Phantoms faced Egyptian and Syrian MiGs in later conflicts, the outcome was decisive. Israeli pilots destroyed 452 Arab aircraft in the first 3 hours of the Six-Day War, a $680 million loss enabled by Operation Diamond's intelligence. Pilots described engagements lasting seconds because they already knew exactly how the enemy would react. Operation Diamond had turned the Arab Air Force's greatest weapon into their greatest weakness. It was the ultimate intelligence victory, a war won before it started. In the years that followed, the operation became part of Mossad's internal mythology. It proved that intelligence was not just about gathering secrets, it was about imagination, empathy, and nerve. They hadn't stormed a base or hacked a system. They had understood one man so completely that he delivered the Soviet Union's pride and joy on a silver platter. For Mossad officers, that lesson shaped every mission afterward. Technology changes, but human weakness does not. The Soviets never publicly acknowledged the theft. Official statements claimed the MiG had crashed or been shot down. Privately, they knew the truth and rewrote entire training doctrines to prevent another defection. But by then, the genie was out of the bottle. Within a year, Israeli pilots used their new understanding of MiG behavior to dominate the skies over the Sinai and Golan Heights. A single aircraft had rewritten the map of the Middle East. Decades later, intelligence historians still call it the most elegant operation of its kind. No shots fired, no deaths, no alarms, just psychology, patience, and timing. When modern analysts talk about hybrid warfare or information dominance, they're describing what Mossad mastered in 1966. They didn't just steal a plane, they stole the Soviet Union's confidence. For Moscow, this wasn't espionage, it was humiliation. A single act of defection had shattered the myth of Soviet control, and that wound never fully healed. In today's world of drones, satellites, and cyber theft, Operation Diamond remains a relic, but also a blueprint. Where once agents smuggled pilots, now they smuggle data. Where once radar codes were photographed on microfilm, now algorithms are copied onto servers. But the principle is identical. In every era, someone, somewhere, is planning to make the impossible land safely on their runway. But history has a rhythm, and Mossad never stopped playing the same tune. 2 decades later, they no longer stole planes. They stole code. The battlefield moved from runways to hard drives. The operation's name, Stuxnet. The mission, cripple Iran's nuclear program without firing a shot. That's the next chapter. Stuxnet, how Israel's Unit 8200 hacked Iran. Watch it next. Because wars aren't fought in the skies anymore. They're fought in silence, one line of code at a time. This is just the beginning. Subscribe for the untold stories that changed history. I will see you in the next one.